and welcome to the Japan Forum webinar series at UC San Diego, the Japan Forum for Innovation and Technology. For those of you who are new to the program, I'm Ulrike Schede. I'm a professor of Japanese business at UC San Diego, and we are at the School of Global Policy and Strategy. If you'd like more information about our programs, please go to our websites. The first one is gps.ucsd.edu. And if you would like to know more about our Japan activities and educational offerings, you can also go to jfit.ucsd.edu, as well as my website, thejapanologist.com. Our webinar series is a weekly event, and just so that you know, we will have next week a discussion on corporate governance with Peter Gurevich, followed by a discussion of Japan's energy and sustainability policy on July 7th, and then the Tokyo Olympics. Later on in July, we're going to talk about the politics of Abenomics. So this will continue throughout the summer. Please stay with us. Today I have Michele Gelfand with me, and before I introduce her, let me just stop sharing this and also I don't actually know how to do this. Cancel the spotlight video. There she is. Hello, Michele. So we're going to talk about culture today. And why is that an interesting topic? So Michele, allow me to give you just a 30-second sort of intro, and then I come and introduce you. So culture in Japan studies has always been a tricky thing. One of the best books on culture, on Japanese culture, as well as shaming, was actually written by Ruth Benedict in 1948 or something like that. She was in Japan after World War II. That was a really carefully done and wonderful study of Japan. Then with the US-Japan trade wars in the 80s, somehow this notion of culture and shame got overused and overextended and was used in a large number of fairly cheap and not particularly careful applications on how the Japanese are different because they're Japanese, and that then led to some sort of cultural determinism. And so in the field of Japan studies, we actually turned away from looking at culture as an explanatory variable. And rational choice came in. The political scientists, kind of went, together with the economists, basically did away with the person, right? And the person is a rational being, and therefore we make decisions in these particular ways. And so then over the last 20 years, we came to realize, companies are a group of people, and markets are places where people trade. And so we need to understand people. We have to bring people back in. And that happened over the last 10 to 20 years in a much more careful way. And you probably have heard of David Kahneman, who is a psychologist who won the Nobel Prize in economics. And that has taken off in economics as behavioral economics. Political scientists followed suit. And so now here we are, and in the business world, we've long known that people matter, but we've lacked frameworks. And here's why Michele is joining me today. Michele Gelfand has provided us with a new way of thinking about cross-cultural differences or cultural differences across countries. And so I'm excited to have you here, Michele. You're a distinguished university professor and professor of psychology at the University of Maryland, College Park. You are a cultural social psychologist and a cross-cultural psychologist. I think you'll explain to us in a moment what exactly that means. But fundamentally, it means you go around the world and use field and experimental and computational methods to understand how places differ. And you are the creator of tight-loose theory, which is what we're going to talk about today. Tight-loose theory posits that there are persistent, significant differences in how tight or loose certain cultures are across countries. You have written a book, Rule Makers, Rule Breakers, and was published in 2018. You have lots of papers, over 25,000 citations. This thing has taken off, Michele, so thank you for taking time out of your busy calendar. And I should mention you have your own website too, michelegelfand.com, if people want to read your papers. So let me suggest that we do the following. We'll let you talk a little bit about tight loose and this whole idea of stereotyping, I guess, countries and what that means. And then I'll bring in a little bit of the Japan application of that theory, and then we'll have a conversation. The audience is invited, as always, to type your Q&A, and then we will end in a moderated discussion of your questions.
That
so
sounds
Michele,
great.
let me spotlight you with the video, and you could share your PowerPoints, and the floor is yours.
Sure, thank you so much. And I have to say that I'm just so delighted to be able to speak to your audience. I'm a very big fan of Japan. I've done a lot of research in Japan over the years, and I'm just crazy about Japanese culture. So I'm a cross-cultural psychologist, and I study the evolution of cultural differences, where they come from, why they might be rational, and what their consequences are for human groups. And this is the field of cross-cultural psychology. And culture is really a puzzle because it's omnipresent, it's all around us, but it tends to be invisible. We really take it for granted. And it's kind of like the story of the two fish. They're swimming along one day and they pass by another fish who says, "Hey boys, how's the water?" And they swim on, and one says to the other, "What the heck is water?" And this just illustrates a really profound point, which is that sometimes the most important realities around us are the ones that we really have difficult seeing. And for fish, that's water, but for humans, that's culture. And, you know, culture is, like you mentioned, it kind of fell off the map in anthropology for some years. And it's, for a while, people were really looking at superficial aspects of culture, East versus West, or rich versus poor, industrialized, non-industrialized. But cross-cultural psychologists are really interested in the deeper cultural codes that are driving behavior, why they tend to evolve the way they do. And I want to introduce you to the concept of tight-loose and walk you through a couple of the studies that first started to pinpoint what this dimension is all about. And it really reflects differences around the world in social norms. And social norms are these unwritten rules for behavior, sometimes that become more formalized, and they're really distinctly human. We have invented human social norms in order to basically predict each other's behavior and coordinate at an unprecedented scales. It's really one of the most important human inventions, social norms, and they're the glue that keep us together. But what I've been looking at is the strength of that glue. And the idea is that some cultures veer tight. They have stronger glue. They have stronger punishments and stronger norms, and they restrict the range of behavior that's permissible in a wide variety of settings. Other cultures have weaker glue. They tend to be loose, and they are more permissive, and they have weaker norms. And actually, this distinction of tight-loose was first discussed, not with these terminology, but by the Greek historian Herodotus, who traveled around the world in the book The Histories centuries ago, started kind of contrasting groups that seem to have a lot of strict rules, like the Egyptians, with groups that are much more loose and seem to actually embrace a lot of different types of behavior, including the Persians. But I wanted to really try to quantify this difference. Can we measure the strength of norms around the world? And can we understand why they vary? And the consequence of them. So let me just walk you through real briefly. The first study that we published on this topic was in the journal, published in the journal Science. And this was done across many different countries, including Japan. And we simply wanted to see, can we place countries on a metric of how strict or permissive they are? Do people even agree around the world with respect to these kinds of cultural differences within their country? And is it distinct from other dimensions of culture, including things like how family-oriented are cultures or how individualistic and collectivistic are there? And what we showed in this study is that we could actually classify countries in terms of the degree to which they were tight or loose. And this distinction was actually unrelated to things like wealth. You could have very rich and tight cultures and very poor and very loose cultures. And what the important point here is that even though all cultures can be classified as tight or loose, if you zoom in, you can see some elements in every culture that are tight or loose. I'll mention this because I think you'll pick up on this later, that Japan in our data was quite tight. And what we could see in the data are the kinds of trade-offs that tightness and looseness provides for groups. And I call this the order versus openness trade-off. So tight cultures in our data had a lot of order. They had lower crime and higher degree of monitoring. They had more uniformity in what people wear and what they drive. Even the clocks in city streets in tight cultures are more likely to be aligned. They're more synchronized. Whereas in loose cultures, the clocks in city streets a lot of times say something totally different. Also, tight cultures have a lot of self-control. When you live in contexts where there are strict rules, you need to learn from a very young age to manage your impulses. And that has a lot of other benefits. There's lower debt in tight cultures. There's lower obesity. There's lower alcoholism, in general, controlling for other factors. And you can think about the idea that loose cultures struggle with order. They have more crime, they have less synchrony, and they have a host of self-regulation failures. But loose cultures in our data corner the market on openness. They're much more tolerant of different types of people, whether they're from different races, religions, and people who are generally stigmatized. They also are more creative. They come up with more ideas that are different in crowdsourcing studies of creativity, and they tend to be more open to change. And on the flip side, tight cultures struggle with openness. So you can see that this is both different criteria that we can think about that each culture can maximize, but has its own liabilities. But the question is what really relates to why these differences evolve in the first place. There's no difference in GDP in tight and loose cultures, no common language that unites tight cultures and loose cultures, no common religion, no common geographic location. But one thing that really is important in predicting tight-loose has to do with the amount of threat that nations have experienced. Think about this in terms of collective threats like Mother Nature. How many times have countries had a lot of natural disasters or famine? Or also human-related threats, like how many times your nation has potentially been invaded over the last 100 years, or has had pathogen outbreaks, or has high population density. Actually, on these factors, Japan scored very high. And in our data, you can see here that in general, that the higher the density, actually as far back as 1500, higher food deprivation and disasters, number of times your nation was potentially invaded in the last 100 years, and degree of pathogen prevalence actually predicted differences in tightness. Now, not all tight cultures have a lot of threat, and not all loose cultures are on easy street, but it is something that's really important in differentiating tight and loose cultures. And I think we'll talk later about how threat is dynamic, and it also can cause dynamic differences, changes in tight and loose. And there's other predictors of tight loose also I should mention. Really, when you think about it, it has to do with the amount of coordination that you need as a nation. And that could be based on threat, but it could be also based on, for example, agriculture, whether you've been growing a lot of rice is something that also correlates with degree of tightness. And also mobility correlates with looseness, as does diversity. So we could talk a little more about other factors. But the more important point here is that once we start to think about why cultures evolve in the first place, we can perhaps have more empathy for cultural differences around the world. And we can even understand ourselves and why we have different cultural codes. Loose cultures in general have had less threat, so they can afford to be more permissive, whereas tight cultures necessitate stronger rules in order to coordinate to survive. This distinction has been also seen across, we've shown it across different levels of analysis. So we can zoom into any country, including Japan, or including China or Germany and the US, and we can try to see where's the variation on this dimension within countries that have a lot of diversity. In the US, you can see this is a map of the degree of tightness in the US, with a lot of the southern states that are darker and Midwestern states veering tighter. And actually, you can see also a map of the degree to which these states have experienced a lot of disasters over the last several decades. And actually the same kind of predictors predict tightness and looseness in the 50 states. And they also have that same order and openness trade-off. When we collected data at the state level, we could see that tight states had a lot of order. They had more people who were conscientious, who were following rules. This is a dimension of personality we call conscientiousness. They had more social organization, more law enforcement, less homeless, less divorce. And they also had more self-control, less drug use and debt, controlling for other factors. But again, loose states struggled with order, but they had a lot more openness in terms of personality, creativity, and less discrimination and more equality. So this seems to be a distinction that this flashlight, we can zoom it into different levels of analysis to see some kind of quasi fractal pattern, fractal coming from physics, this repeated pattern across levels. I want to just show you one more level of analysis we can explore, because I think this relates a lot to your book, your wonderful book, which is the organizational level. Here again, we can zoom in, and all cultures have organizations that are tight or loose, and they follow some of the similar kinds of DNA that we've been talking about in terms of the way that they organize. Tight organizations have a lot of rules and predictability. They're more formal, and they have stronger socialization. and they have people who are more prevention focused and managing their impulses. They tend to evolve in industries that require a lot of coordination or have a lot of safety types of threats, like in manufacturing or hospital or airlines. And this is because we need more coordination, and tight organizations help to provide that kind of really strong glue that keeps people from really having a lot of danger. Loose organizations have a very different set of people, practices, and leaders. They're more flexible and experimental. They're more informal, and they have less accountability, less monitoring, and also people who are more focused on taking risks. They tend to evolve in industries like startups, design, and tech, where there's fewer types of safety needs, and there's a lot of mobility and change. And I'll just mention one more thing about loose and tight organizations. They tend to have different types of leaders. So in some studies that we did across many different countries and managers and organizations, when we ask people, what are the behaviors that contribute to outstanding leaders? The answer to this question varies dramatically around the world. And with respect to tight and loose, people in tight cultures like autonomous leaders who call the shots. People in loose groups tend to like charismatic, team-oriented, visionary types of leaders. So this is all to just suggest that the people and the practices and the leadership that define tight and loose organizations, like we see at states and nations, tend to be very different. And you can imagine what happens when these two types of organizations try to merge with each other, the kinds of conflicts they might have based on these big differences. And actually, long ago, there was a great example of this, the Daimler-Chrysler failure between the German context and the US context. And people didn't use the word tight loose, but I would venture to say that a lot of that merger, which was at first seen as a match made in heaven, actually had a lot of problems with tight loose. In a recent Harvard Business Review article, we actually showed and quantified what's the price tag for tight loose mergers. And we studied close to 5,000 cross-border acquisitions. And we were looking at differences in tight loose before these organizations merged, and in particular how it affected ROA change. And we controlled for a lot of different factors, but the most important thing to show you is that there was a big difference in terms of the decrements that you see in performance when you had tight and loose organizations merging, up to actually $245 million change in ROA for even one standard deviation difference in tight loose. That's just to suggest that we need to really be mindful that not just strategically do we want to have compatibility, but we have to anticipate the cultural iceberg that comes with these kinds of mergers. I want to mention on a more optimistic note, and I think we'll talk about this, Ulrike, is that culture is dynamic. We actually develop social norms, and we can harness the power of social norms when we need to pivot and we need to negotiate these differences. And I hope that the language of tight and loose can help us to do this. As I mentioned, if we ahead of time prepare to negotiate culture, think about where are we on the tight loose continuum in our organizations, in our societies, and do a cultural assessment that tries to diagnose this. And then we can be prepared to think about, how do we pivot? What domains need to be tight? Which ones can be looser? It's actually an exciting idea that we can actually be mindful in terms of creating culture and managing cultural differences. And this is what I call, drawing on Charles O'Reilly and Michael Tushman's work, tight loose ambidexterity. And I'll just give one last example of this because I think we'll talk about it later. The idea here is that organizations might need to veer tight or loose given their industry and their context, but sometimes they might get too extreme. And sometimes we might need to actually make tight cultures more flexible. It's something I call flexible tightness. Insert some discretion into some domains into that system. On the flip side, sometimes organizations might be getting too loose, too chaotic. We might need to insert some tightness, or what I call structured looseness, into that system. Of course, these are really challenging things to do, and I think we'll talk about this. Can culture be changed? I think we can also think about this even in our own households, and I'll leave you with one more slide, which is to understand your own tight-loose mindset. Where do you veer in terms of your predilection for rules? Are you someone who likes rules, who likes to manage your impulses, who likes a lot of structure? Or are you someone that doesn't really notice rules a whole lot and likes to take risks and doesn't really mind ambiguity, even though we can actually tighten and loosen depending on the context? For example, when you're in a library, you likely tighten up versus when we're in a party. but we nevertheless each have our own default, basically preference in terms of the degree to which we like rules or like to avoid them. And on my website, I have a tight loose mindset quiz that's based on the science paper. And I think the most important thing is that culture starts with understanding ourselves. And after we understand where we've evolved as a person, as an organization, as a society, and why that might have made sense for us, then we can start to think about other people's mindsets. Why might they veer tighter or looser? Truth be told, I veer tighter than my husband, who's a lawyer, and we have a lot of negotiation over conflicts that can come from the tight-loose distinction. And they're eminently negotiable, and I think I'm going to just leave it there and then open it up to Ulrike, who has some other comments. And thanks again also for having me.
Well, thank you. That's terrific. Michele has this really great story about the household debate about the dishwasher. Is it important to put the stuff into the dishwasher just so, or can you just throw it in since it's only going to be in there for an hour? Who cares, right?
I think it's a great test of tight loose because I get a lot of negative feedback on how I load the dishwasher.
So here's it's just a terrific concept. It's easy, it's intuitive, it's clean, it's wonderful, it's very done based on very careful research, and it is making some waves also in the research on international business, as you suggested, M&A, and so I could give you 100 examples of attempted mergers and acquisitions between Japanese and non-Japanese companies that were all fraught with difficulty, right? So before we kind of start a conversation, allow me to just add the Japan application, because after all, this is a Japan so let's zoom in on Japan here, and I want to go back to my PowerPoints if I can. Here we go. So yes, thank you for plugging my book. So I have this new book about the business reinvention of Japan, and tight loose theory is the framework that allowed me to kind of get into the depth of what Japanese companies have to do and the background before which they are reinventing their own companies, right? So how do you manage change in a tight culture? So this is actually Michele's chart. She was too modest to show it. So this very careful research that they started out with had a number of countries where they went in and they asked people questions like, is it okay to eat in an elevator? Is it okay to sing in the streets? Is it okay to wear headphones in a restaurant? And so forth and so on. And then you could measure for each country how much people agreed, and the variation within each country, right? And so you get the scores, and what we see here is Japan is fairly tight, similar to South Korea, but also Norway and India. And the United States is fairly loose, though not quite as loose as, say, New Zealand. And so some people gave me feedback on this, and I said, well, India and Japan are clearly two completely different countries. How can they be on the same spot of this thing? So my answer to that question is that culture, so the set of social behavioral norms, has three components. And what you're measuring, Michele, is consensus and intensity, right? So consensus is the degree to which people agree that these norms are important, and intensity is to what extent they're willing to actually sanction violators. The content, the number one here is actually the actual prescription of what is the right thing to do. So in Japan, for example, you must not wear shoes inside the house. Nobody ever does that, right? But it's no law. There's no rule, but nobody would ever do it, right? Don't wear shoes inside the house. And if you did wear shoes inside the house, you would never hear the end of it. In fact, you might be kicked out of the country. So then so when we talk about tight loose, we talk about consensus and intensity. So in India, they could be very tight, but on different behavioral prescriptions. So then what are the behavioral prescriptions for Japan? And I think there are three that we can use to kind of think about this. One is to be, or appear to be, polite and considerate. The second is to be appropriate in the given situation. So if you've ever been to Tokyo, you know that nobody in Tokyo would ever come to work with green hair. And you would not dye your hair green because that would not be appropriate. And the third is about behaviors. Don't choose actions that inconvenience others. Right? So don't cause a meiwaku, don't be noisy, don't do things that rock the boat. So be polite, be appropriate, and be normal are the three prescriptions. Now, the good news is you don't have to be perfect 100% of the time. So if you want to be a reformer, you might actually get away with rocking the boat a little bit as long as you're appropriate and polite about it. Or you can be impolite as long as your hair is not green and you don't inconvenience others. So that's how change is happening in Japan, right? And so then what I was then interested in is going into the Japanese company and say, okay, so what does it mean to change corporate culture in Japan? And corporate culture is, of course, sort of the shared sense of what's the right thing to do in our company. And every company has a culture. It's the way we do things, right? And because it sits on top of the country culture, in Japan, it's mostly tight. And so the Japanese aspects of corporate culture are things like many meetings and due process, and it all has to be by schedule, it can't be late, and a very sensitive, Michelle, what you call social radar is very important, right? So do I fit in? Am I doing the right thing? Am I behaving the right way? And so there's a lot of dance around making a decision and be polite and appropriate in doing that, right? But the beauty of tight-loose theory is this deep understanding that it is socially constructed. Right? And so insofar as the culture, a corporate culture, is socially constructed, it can be managed and can be changed. And so then my story is about why everything in Japan takes so long. And it takes so long because change has to be managed within the confines of tight expectations and preferences for due process and meetings and so forth. All right, so then, so I'll end on this note. So in my view, and I think, Michelle, we might be disagreeing here a little bit, so this will be interesting. But my sense is that Japan will always be tight. Japan has 1,500 earthquakes a year, and it's very important that second nature kicks in when something like Fukushima or a tsunami or something happens. And we saw it at the time. Right? People were just doing exactly what they were told to do. There was no looting, no crime, no upheaval at all after the 3/11 earthquake. And so Japan will always be tight. And so then what does it mean to change culture in a tight setting? And my suggestion is that means is you can't change tight, but you can change the definition of what is the right behavior. So for instance, you could say, it's okay to not wear a tie to work, or it's okay to dye your hair. And then people would actually do it, right? And so managing change in Japan would mean to very slowly move people to a new normal, right? And so ironically, that means that as Japanese companies are trying to change toward being looser, they have to do this in a very highly methodically formulaic structured way to meet the preferences of structure. So that's sort of in a nutshell my story here. Let's, so you think it can be dynamic, and I think it's kind of static, but maybe that has something to do with the external threat again, right? So Japan will have more earthquakes. We know this, right? Everybody knows it. This is not something that people disagree about. The question is when, not if. But other countries might think they are done with the external threats, and so then maybe they loosen up a little bit. Or where does the dynamic come from?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you on change is really difficult. In fact, a lot of our research shows that it's much harder to go from tight to loose than from loose to tight. There's some kind of evolutionary kind of bias against not taking risks when you've been tightened up. So it takes longer. But we know that when threat decreases, that it can happen. The issue, I think, for organizations is that there's these underlying needs that need to be satisfied. In tight context, there's a great need for control, and that makes sense because of the threat. So people feel really threatened. They feel like they risk getting out of control. And that's why very small baby steps and a lot of consensus and a lot of tight managing that process can help people feel safe. On the flip side, when you're trying to make a loose culture tighter, like think Uber or Tesla in the United States, or arguably that we're getting kind of chaotic and too loose, they have these needs for autonomy. So adding more structure to the systems it actually creates a lot of reactance. Or you see now, we could talk about COVID later. We have data on COVID and tight loose. But, you know, and I argued also in an op-ed in the Boston Globe in early March that the US and other loose organizations, because they've had less threat, are going to have more problems sacrificing freedom for constraint. Whereas in Japan, people have been for centuries kind of developing that muscle that no, when there's threat, we tighten, we don't start thinking about our liberty. But I guess my point is that I do think that we can strategically change cultures, but just in very specific ways. So for example, I'm working with the military in the US, and obviously the military in many cultures is tight. It needs to be, it's a lot of threat. But you know, not everything needs to be regulated in the military. Like, why do we need to wear the same socks or have certain types of haircuts? My interviews of military personnel would suggest that the idea was, well, if people follow those rules, they'll follow the more important ones on the battlefield. But actually, when we stop and think about it, maybe those are not necessary, those rules. Like you were mentioning, maybe we can kind of collectively discuss what rules are absolutely necessary. I think one of the things about culture is that we don't discuss it and we don't negotiate it. But once we start thinking about it, like for example, now we're in the military, we developed a domain-specific measure of tight-loose. How much do we have rules and punishments for clothing, for time, for lots of different domains? Once we see like sort of our profile, we can say, wait, do we really need a lot of rules in this context? Because, you know, the reality is that we want to try to not be sacrificing openness for having too much order. Or likewise, we know that the loose groups have a lot of openness, but they might really have a hard time scaling up. So they really need to pivot. But my hope is that we can sort of start thinking about this mindfully of which domains, which contexts do we absolutely need to have strict rules around, and then when can we loosen up? And by the way, that happens in households too. Like my dishwasher behavior has been negotiated. Todd is okay with that ridiculous behavior. But, you know, in some domains, we're pretty strict in terms of, for example, health and studying hard and how we treat each other. But how messy the house is one domain we kind of said, all right, we're going to give the kids a little slack on that. Not everyone would come to that conclusion, and he might have lost that negotiation. But the issue is to think about this mindfully and think about the domains where we absolutely have to have strict rules. Because in any negotiation, you need to prioritize and then trade off on your low priority issues.
So one of the reactions I get when I talk about this, and I'm not nearly as eloquent as you are, but when I try to talk about this in Japan, the reaction often is like, oh yeah, so bad. We are so bad. Tight is bad. Loose is good. And that comes out of a sense that Silicon Valley is sort of the brand for loose, and it's innovative and it's hip and it's cool, and it's a culture. But it's not actually true, right? To think of this as good or bad. They're both good at something, and they're very pragmatic, right? So tight is good for something, and so there's a reason why places like Japan are tight, which is the earthquake and the tsunami and the typhoon and all these other good Japanese words, and bad things happen to the country. But then on the other hand, loose is very is important for maybe creativity, break it, fix it, sort of Facebook stuff, right? and so we shouldn't think about this as good or bad. Is that right?
I mean, people ask me all the time, which is better? And, you know, like you said, like one strength is another's liability and vice versa. So, and actually that's what's so important is that we try to work with each other to combine the best of both worlds. So for example, in innovation, when we're trying to innovate, that actually involves both tight and loose codes. We need looseness to create ideas, but we need tightness to scale it up. And when you think about countries like in the Startup Nation, a great book about Israel, the authors talk about how Israel's really good at creativity, but they're not necessarily great at scaling up. Whereas somewhere like Singapore is really good at scaling up, but maybe not as much at creating and breaking things. So we can kind of think about how do we kind of trade off on order and openness. I will say one thing we do know from our research, though, is that it's the extremes that actually are really dysfunctional. So when you think about what's bad, what's good or bad about tight loose, I call this the Goldilocks Principle. It's named after that, that famous storybook that's now in many, many languages. Not too hot, not too cold, not too soft, not too hard. And the idea is that cultures need to veer tight or loose for good reasons, but as they get extremely loose to the point that they're almost normless, or extremely tight to the extent that they're really repressive, our data would suggest that they have higher suicide, both of these extremes, lower happiness, and really lower well-being in general. And that applies to organizations as well. You think about United Airlines, the US had a big PR problem with, some years ago. And, basically what we found from talking to United Airlines employees and reading about the cultures, that was getting too tight. Of course, they should be tight. We don't want airlines making all sorts of weird decisions. But arguably, they were starting to follow rules. They were helicopter-like, and they were not thinking about, for themselves. And that company needed to insert some flexibility, some discretion into the system in non-safety related domains. So, I think that's one general principle. And that applies to many things, the Goldilocks Principle, when it comes to norms. So, for example, too strict to parenting or too laissez-faire parents produce maladaptive kids. And as I mentioned, it applies to organizations as well. And there's a lot of interesting examples. The Paradox of Choice book by Barry Schwartz, same thing. Too little choice or too much choice is problematic. And so I think back to Aristotle, we need to think about how do we have moderation? When people say what's bad, what's good, tight or loose, I say, it depends. But we know that this kind of curvilinear effect is very strong, in the meaning that the extremes are problematic. And we need to really keep an eye out for those extremes because they cause a lot of problems. And I talk a lot about it in the book, toward the end of the book. And for example, one last example is one more example is the internet, especially I'm talking about the US. I mean, it's where we live now, but it's a normless place in many ways. And on some of our data, initial data are showing that it's not how much time you spend online, but it's how normless you perceive it to be that really is related to lower well-being. And I think this is a prime example of a place where we're going to need to negotiate norms from the top down, from what these organizations do in terms of monitoring content, and but also from the bottom up in terms of, we want to be in a world, we want to be in a place where people are behaving themselves, where they have some accountability. And we know that when people are online, they don't feel accountable. And that's a big problem.
So one of the things that we see in countries that are at the extreme end of whether that's Norway or New Zealand, is that people actually like these release valves, as I call them. So in the Japan case, everybody's always very nice and orderly and all of that. But when it goes to, drinking at night and then the karaoke afterwards, there's some structure to it and you have to behave this way. But basically everything goes, right? It's just like tremendous sort of, let go moment, which is momentarily and, sort of then is reversed. Whereas in California, I observe a lot of people like to submit themselves to very choreographed behavior, like yoga classes where everybody is in the same outfit, or sing in a choir, or, things that are structured where people are synchronous in their movements, and people like it because it gives a sort of a structure to something that's otherwise pretty wild.
Yeah, I mean, I think you hit the nail on the head in the sense that all cultures, if they're healthy, have some, if they're tight cultures, you have some domains in which you allow for that latitude. It might be in a city street, like in Tokyo, Takeshi, how do you pronounce that? Takahishi Street, or a context like drinking behavior where you kind of allow people to let go. In some cultures, it has to do with a holiday where you just go crazy, like Mardi Gras in the US. On the flip side, even loose cultures have tight domains. And my theory would be that the domains that seem to be really valued tend to be tightly regulated in any country. So take the US, we're pretty strict in terms of our privacy. Like you don't just show up at someone's house. You get a lot of really negative feedback. In fact, we have these holidays like Halloween where you can go out and just visit people's homes and get candy. And it's a bizarre holiday. And I always think the day after Halloween, I would love to just go up to someone's house and say, can I have some food? Or just show up on any day. And they'd be like, what are you doing? But even places like New Zealand, which is really pretty loose, you'll see people walking barefoot in banks in New Zealand, and you'll see couches being burned on some university campuses. And generally speaking, they've had some conflict, of some share of threat, but in general, it's a very loose culture. But there's some domains that are really strictly regulated. And again, it speaks to the importance of values. So, New Zealand is very egalitarian. And so unlike the US, which is very kind of competitive, in New Zealand, people take very seriously being modest and not being standing out. And they call it the tall poppy syndrome. And if you try to stand out, then you're in big trouble in New Zealand, even in a loose context. And actually, my understanding of COVID-19 in New Zealand, apart from the fact they had incredible leadership, is that people are holding each other accountable. Like, no one is allowed to break the rules. If everyone has to follow the rules, then you better not break them. So they had a very different response, of course, for a variety of reasons. But the more important point here is that every culture should have some tight and loose elements. And I'd be curious from your audience, what other domains and contexts in Japan allow for that. And also we see regional variation, of course, in Japan. With Hokkaido, I would imagine is a lot looser than Tokyo. And we can talk about maybe regional variation. There was a big study of regional variation in China that just came out in the PNAS, Proceedings of the National Academy, that rank order the Chinese 30 plus provinces in tight loose. And I'd love to kind of find out how we could do that in Japan, because I think it would be super interesting.
That would be super interesting, and I would hypothesize that the South is always a little looser than the North. But so we have a question here. Peter wants to know about the within-country variance. So what you're really measuring with tight loose is the mean of the normal distribution, right? So individuals fall on some sort of spectrum, and so we draw some sort of normal distribution. But when you say a country is tight, that means that the average person in that country is tighter. Is that right? Well, or how do we want to think about individuals in this logic?
Yeah, I think it's really super important that we're talking about means, but that also suggests that there's different contexts and domains where we would see the opposite pattern of looseness. Think about it like personality, in the sense that we all differ. We're all different as individuals, but we can, mostly we can think about how extroverted or introverted are we. Of course, we can change that code depending on the context, but we have a kind of a preference for where we fall on that. And the same is the case for cultural dimensions. They're dynamic, they change, but in general, because of our histories of ecological threat and other historical factors, we tend to develop social norms that match and help us to adapt to those contexts. So I wouldn't say it's about people, it's really about the context of social norms. And of course, people have to be socialized to fit into maintaining those social norms. You can't have a tight culture without people who are conscientious, who are managing their impulses, who like structure. You can't have loose norms. In the US, you need to train kids to tolerate ambiguity because they're going to see a lot of weird stuff out there. And so that's not to say that, in the US, we'll still have people, some who like rules and some who don't. But in general, we could see that the situations that they encounter are going to be of a looser nature. I'll just give you one more example of this. In the study in science, we rank ordered situations in terms of how tight or loose they were. So libraries are much tighter, and funerals, where there's a restricted range of behavior. Elevators are much tighter than being at a party or being in a public park. And in every culture, the rank order of situational constraint was identical. But cultures really shift in terms of the degree to which those situations are tight or loose. So for example, being in a public park is loose in all cultures, but it's much tighter in Pakistan than it is in the US. So the way we construct situations, the way we hold them in place, what we allow for in terms of variation can vary dramatically around the world in the same situation. Even libraries, I would say that some of my students that come from tighter cultures to the US, they're just horrified when they go to a library and they see people doing all sorts of weird stuff. And I'm like, or in the classroom for that matter. The US is, there's obviously differences in different disciplines, but you'll see people with purple hair in your class. You'll see them, munching on their sandwiches and on their earphones. And I try to explain to my students from tighter cultures that, they're not disrespecting me. This is just the looseness of the context. And of course, again, it varies depending on the state and the context. But you can imagine that it's a big problem when people try to change cultures. We've done some work on expatriation, and we found that tighter cultures are much harder to adapt to, in part because there's a lot of rules. But what we found, which I thought was super interesting, is that people's personalities that matched the cultural context did just as well in tight cultures. So people who were more conscientious and we're more rule abiding, they had no problem adapting in places like Japan. So
right.
we need to think about that when we send people abroad rather than just
right.
to their own.
And the opposite is also true, right? So Japan gets a lot of flack for its immigration policies. And it turns out Japanese and Norwegian immigration policies are very similar. And they're both tight, right? And so what does it mean? It means that, so that, you know, if you want to be in that place, in that tight place, you have to learn the language. And of course, in Japan, the first thing you have to learn is how to separate the garbage properly, because very important thing in Tokyo. And there are all these structures and all these programs, and there are all of these things that immigrants or visitors have to go through and sign up for and take a class here and attend this safety meeting there. And it's very, very structured. And it has this nice side effect that it creates a self-selection, that people who like the structure love Japan, right? And or at least they can handle it for a while. And people that are a little bit looser might say, I'd rather go to another country.
Yeah. And sometimes they figure that out the hard way. You know, I think we don't take culture seriously when we send our expatriates abroad. And by the way, I think the issue is also that people from tight cultures tend to see immigrants as dangerous, when in fact they actually really want to integrate in many cases. A lot of research suggests that, you know, a lot of migrants want to integrate. They might want to hold on to some of their cultural patterns, but also they are willing to adapt. And I think we need to really bring immigrant and native populations together, because often they really stereotype each other. We find that in our research that tight cultures see their immigrants as being wildly loose, when in fact they're not as loose as they think they are. They actually might be much more likely to abide by rules. And we know that our research shows that people need to actually come together with high quality contact in order to see, wow, they're more like us than they're different. They're not as dangerous as we thought. And I know a reporter in Japan just interviewed me recently for a piece that said, we really want to open up, you know, and it's something that we can start to talk about, you know, that people who are coming here, yeah, exactly, with structure and with context, we see these people are not dangerous. You know, they're trying to adapt and they want to adapt. And of course, it helps us to be more creative and diverse.
So we have a bunch of questions around. Some of them is, you know, is culture the same as social, and, you know, and is there, you know, a bunch of background questions. But I want to get us into the COVID-19 response situation. So you have a paper with your colleagues where you look systematically at how countries have fared in the current pandemic and what might explain this. And of course, there's no silver bullet explanation of why Japan has been doing, you know, comparatively very well so far. And you know, there are always these idiosyncratic reasons. But can you talk a little bit about the whole COVID-19 situation? You mentioned leadership and preferences that people express, and also the dynamic aspect of this, right? So this is a moment. This is sort of a weird moment, even for the United States. Everybody has to put a mask on. People say no. Yeah. So what have you learned from this pandemic moment?
Yeah. Well, I think it's a great question. And, you know, early, as I mentioned in March, I wrote an op-ed that was really just trying to explain tight loose theory to the general public, that under collective threat, we really need to tighten up. And the prediction was it's going to be harder for loose groups to do that. And actually, that's what the data suggests, is that there's really two important ways that we can coordinate during a collective threat. And both are really critical. And one has to do with government efficiency. Government efficiency is basically those nations that can quickly coordinate the private and the public sector, that don't have a lot of debt, that are able to really get things to happen quickly. Japan's high on government efficiency. We also, at the same time, though, need people to be able to follow rules and social norms. And that's where tightness comes in. And that's exactly what we found. We studied nations, about 50 some odd nations, from the early parts of the COVID till early April, and which is really a very critical period. And we downloaded data on COVID cases and on death rates. And we tracked this over time using hierarchical linear modeling. And we found that the combination of tightness and government efficiency was critical for containing the curves, flattening the curves, and also for containing death rates. And the idea is that they're both needed. Even if you have very efficient governments, if you don't have people following the rules, it's not going to help you. Or you might have people following the rules, but if they have, or people might be following the rules, but they have inefficient governments, then it also is a problem. And so the best case scenario in the early stages was places like Japan and Singapore. Germany tended to fall high on government efficiency and also tightness. Of course, there's multiply determined, and that data we control for lots of factors like population density and wealth, average age, and so forth. But these factors, institutions, i.e. government efficiency and tightness, were really explaining variance in these rates. Now you have this historical moment, like in the leadership, that is really bizarre. I mean, we are really struggling here in the United States, as everyone knows, and it's really bad. It's just something that's an accident because I call it an evolutionary mismatch. Because under high threat, evolution would suggest that we need strict norms and swift responses, and we're having this mismatch based on politics and polarization. Which, in evolutionary theory would suggest that we're going to suffer. And this is what we've seen. I do want to mention one other thing and then toss it back out to the audience, which is I'm predicting that we have to go through this kind of tight, loose dance in the next, 18 months, that we need to quickly tighten. Every country, including Japan and Singapore for that matter, might have an uptick in cases. And that's a good point where we need high efficiency and tightness. But when it's safe, we can loosen. And we need to really important. We need clear, consistent leadership to tell us when it's safe to do so. So I think both tight and loose are really going to be dynamically changing, and the countries that can adapt to that dance will do the best in the coming months, of course, until we find a vaccine. So that's the broad picture.
So we have a bunch of questions that I think we can answer while we're staying with the COVID. So first of all, John's question is culture the same as social things? And I think that's the definition of culture and the way you use it is the norms, the socially created norms of behavior.
That's right.
And then there's a question from Ken who wants to know at what age people are and I just want to throw in a little vignette from Japan and it has something to do with a social radar and social proofing. So social proofing is a concept that says that humans, us, always like to fit in. We like to be nice. We like to be liked. So when we are in a situation, we read the room and then we say, okay, this is the appropriate behavior in this particular moment. And that has nothing to do with age. But the stricter the rules is, or the higher the sanctions against deviance, the more people are sort of trying to fit in. And so you see that in Japan. It's not innate at all. It's like when a gaijin, a foreigner, comes to Tokyo, to Japan, within 2 weeks they learn how to, they're on the phone, they're still, they're not throwing trash around, they're speaking a lower voice in the subway. Their social radar gets much more sensitive. And so in a way we could define tightness as we need a higher social sensitivity, right? And so I'm wondering whether that's actually sort of a way in which loose places can become tight under this pandemic, where we just say, look, we just need to, nobody should be the idiot that causes this next outbreak, right? Which is, by the way, how it works in Japan. Nobody wants to be the one that started a new cluster. Nobody wants to be at fault, right? So people stay home, they take themselves out. And we don't have that in the United States. Is that because our social radar is not as sensitive, or because we don't want to, or we don't feel like it? Or what's going on?
I think it's a great question, and I'm going to get back to the age issue and when people introduce the tightness concept, Kenneth, that's a great question. I think the United States is in a really weird situation where people that are not following the rules, not social distancing, in those states that are doing that, they're actually high degree of Trump supporters. And they're places where they're looking to Trump to set the norm. Tight cultures look to the leaders, and they're looking to the leader. And what you see is that they're not taking it as seriously. This is my speculation, because they're following the ruler that's giving the wrong rules. So, you can have tight cultures that really struggle if they're not being appropriately advised by their leaders. You really need strong signaling in this kind of case. I also think it's a context where, people have a harder time sacrificing freedom for constraint. But on the other hand, in other contexts, the U.S. has tightened up rather quickly. Look at 9/11 or World War II. So this is a distinct moment in history where our polarization, our following the wrong rules is really a problem. I was actually just in the South recently. We were the only people wearing masks in the context where we were. I mean, it's really something problematic. And I think what I'm arguing is, just like you're saying, you need to kind of help people who are trying to loosen up when they're too tight to be very structured. we need different advice for people who need to tighten up. And that is that it's going to be temporary. And we know from our computational models that the more you tighten up, the more you can lower the threat, that it has a direct connection with actually having efficacy, collective efficacy for reducing the threat, which might come back again, the tight loose dance. But we can't shame people in the US. I mentioned this recently in an op-ed and in a program. We need to try to talk about how this is temporary, and your autonomy will come back once we collectively deal with this. I want to mention to Kenneth, though, one of the youngest samples that we've had in our data are 3-year-olds. And we bring 3-year-olds into the lab. And this was actually a social class study. We're trying to understand the working class in the US, which we hypothesized would be tighter because they're trying to avoid falling into poverty, as compared to the middle and upper class, where you have a wide range of variability that's appropriate because you have a cushion, you have a safety net, you can afford to make mistakes. And we brought these kids into the lab, and we couldn't ask them, what do you think about tight loose? I mean, we'd love to, right? I mean, I talk about tight loose all the time. My poor kids, right? They're gonna, they're really tired of this concept. But what we could do with this is use this classic paradigm in developmental psychology where we have the kids interacting with a puppet. And it's called Max the Puppet, and they learn to befriend the puppet, and they play new games with the puppet that have rules. And then all of a sudden, in the middle of the game, the puppet starts violating the rules and starts announcing that he's playing by the rules. And what we do is we simply videotape the kids and see what do they do. And these are independent raters. And what we can see in that study is that it was quite clearly the working class kids were much more upset with Max, the norm violator, than the middle class kids who were laughing at Max and didn't take it as seriously. And what you can think about is these differences are socialized very early. We know parents have certain implicit theories about what does our kid need to fit into this culture. It's like doing a great job analysis, but for culture. And when we surveyed working class and upper class parents, they had very different ideas around rules. If I say to you, what do you think about rules? And tell me 5 things when you think about rules, I can code those responses. And we see that it's the working class that thinks they're pretty good. They have very positive connotations of rules. It's the middle class and upper class parents that think rules are kind of negative. So that's just important to say that these things start early. I don't think people recognize it. They don't understand that this is something that we need to talk about, and we can use this lens to understand and appreciate each other's differences and why we differ beyond our pocketbooks. So that's just a broad, answer to your question. I have a whole chapter on social class in the book where I talk about that. I have a picture of that puppet and one of the kids that describes the study.
So what I found fascinating about the book is you have many examples where tight and loose, of course, is across countries, right? So Japan is tighter than the US, but even within tight places or loose places, you get tight or loose behavior. So for instance, your example about the experiment with the trash, so a bunch of bicycles in an alleyway and somebody put trash paper into the bicycle's baskets. And when the alleyway is dirty already, people think nothing of taking the trash out and throwing it on the ground. But if the alleyway is nice and clean and spick and span, then people leave the trash in the basket and throw it away somewhere else. Right? And so we can actually also nudge people into that sort of behavior, right? So that's the sort of the applied thing.
Yeah, that's right. There's another example of that in the book. I talk about these studies where people bring people into a room, a laboratory, that's either super messy or super clean. And sure enough, in the super messy room, people are more creative, but they have less self-control. They actually behave more poorly, according to the measures of the study. Whereas in the clean room, people are less creative, but they're higher in self-control. So you can think about that. I mean, you don't even want to know what my office looks like because it's really messy. But I know where everything is kind of. But the point is, like you're saying, like we can go to a library or a symphony. And now it's like, I can't stop thinking about it when I'm in different contexts. And you could start thinking about, is this context getting loose or is it tight? Like, by looking at the variability of behavior and how much people have a lot of accountability, and you'll start noticing that we effortlessly deal with these shifts in our cultures. Now, with that said, like, Japan, it tends to have tighter situations than the US across the board, even though there's some context with looseness. And likewise, a lot of the situations in the US are constructed to have more permissive, a larger range of behaviors, even given that. So that's another layer.
And that's really your theory, that those differences are significant across countries in ways that actually allow us to use this framework for our research.
Yeah, I'll just say one more thing is that we have a paper coming out next week in the Proceedings of the Royal Society B, which looks at this whole construct in pre-industrial societies. So we coded like 80 some odd ethnographies, and we coded different domains of life, socialization and gender and sexuality and funerals and ethics, because anthropologists gather lots of data and write a lot about each of those domains in many societies. And what we could see in that study is it had the same kind of logic as a lot of the other stuff we've been talking about. So for people that are interested in this work, just come to my website, send me your stories. On the website, there's a place to send me your stories. I really would love your stories. I wrote this book to get in touch, get outside of the academic bubble so that I can learn more about everyone's everyday lives and how this kind of is something that you now see as important in your own life, or things you've noticed that will actually spur some research in our group.
It has already spurred a lot of research, and it's a really cool tool for international business research. So I expect many more papers, many more citations coming your way. Thank you, Michele, for joining us. Take time out of your busy calendar or summer vacation, whatever it may be, a dishwasher cleanup. Thank you very much for joining us. It's a terrific conversation, and we'll continue. People will probably be in touch, and I'll take the quiz. So
okay, great.
Well,
thank you so much for having me, guys.
Thank you, everybody. And before we go, I should maybe announce that next week, I'll not show the slides, next week we'll have Peter Gurevich, the founding dean and distinguished professor at the University of California, San Diego. And Peter and I will talk about the politics of corporate governance, the system that is established to rein in corporate executives, I guess, or maybe there's a different definition. Come back next week, we'll tell you all about it. Thank you very much. Thank you, Michele.
Take care. Goodbye.